The New Neighbor, Part 1. Have you ever felt someone's eyes on you in the dark? That prickling sensation at the back of your neck when you're alone, but not quite? For Steve, that feeling would become all too familiar, though by then it would already be too late. The Tudor house next door had been vacant for months. Steve had grown accustomed to its emptiness, just as he'd grown accustomed to his own. 2 weeks since Melissa had packed her things and left, taking with her the noise and warmth that had made his apartment feel like home. Now he passed his evenings in silence, the dull glow of his TV, the only company he kept. Walking home from work one evening in late October, Steve noticed something different about the Tudor house. The "For Rent" sign that had stood in the yard since summer was gone. Someone new had moved in while the rest of the neighborhood slept. The following day, as dusk settled over the quiet street, Steve spotted a figure working in the yard of the Tudor house. A man, tall and lean, with movements that seemed almost too graceful, too deliberate. Something about the way he moved made Steve stop and stare a moment longer than he should have. When the man turned and caught Steve watching, he didn't seem bothered. Instead, he smiled, a flash of white teeth in the fading light, and waved Steve over. "Just moved in," the man said as Steve approached. His voice was deep with a subtle accent Steve couldn't quite place. "I'm Henrik. Most people call me Henry." "Steve," he replied, shaking the hand offered by Henry. Henry's skin was cool to the touch, despite his yard work. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Under the porch light, Steve could see Henry more clearly. He was older, mid-40s perhaps, but remarkably well-preserved, with sharp cheekbones and eyes so dark they seemed to pull you in. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but striking, magnetic. "What brings you to this part of town?" Steve asked, suddenly aware he was still holding Henry's hand. He let go quickly. Henry's smile widened, revealing perfect teeth. "A change of scenery. My previous home was too full of memories." Their conversation drifted to casual topics: the neighborhood, the weather, the peculiar architecture of the Tudor house. As they talked, Steve found himself oddly captivated. There was something in Henry's manner, in the way his eyes seemed to hold Steve's just a beat too long, that left him feeling both uneasy and intrigued. Their paths crossed several more times over the following days. Brief encounters on the street, a nod through windows, a casual exchange at the local convenience store. Each interaction felt somehow charged, as if there were currents running beneath the surface of their simple conversations. During one such encounter, they discovered a shared passion for video games. Henry mentioned having the latest PlayStation 5 Pro and copies of Elden Ring, Shadow Realm, and Call of Duty Black Ops 6, games Steve had been dying to play. "You should come over sometime," Henry suggested, his dark eyes gleaming. "I've been looking for a worthy opponent." "That would be great," Steve replied, surprised by his own eagerness. Since Melissa had left, he'd barely socialized, preferring to nurse his wounded pride in solitude. Yet something about Henry's invitation felt impossible to refuse. "Tonight, perhaps?" Henry asked. Unless you have other plans. Steve didn't, so as darkness fell, he found himself walking the short distance to the Tudor house, a 6-pack of beer in hand as a peace offering. The interior of Henry's home was nothing like Steve had imagined. The outside might have been classic Tudor, but inside was an eclectic mix of eras, antique furniture that looked centuries old, sharing space with sleek, modern technology. Oil paintings in ornate frames hung beside contemporary art pieces. It was as if time itself had collapsed within these walls. "This is quite a place," Steve said, trying not to stare at what appeared to be a genuine medieval sword mounted above the fireplace. "I've collected things over the years," Henry replied with a dismissive wave. "One develops certain tastes with age." They settled in the den where a massive flat screen dominated one wall. The room was dimly lit, with most of the light coming from the television and a few strategically placed lamps that cast long shadows into the corners. The gaming began casually enough. They played Elden Ring Shadow Realm first, their characters battling through digital nightmares as Henry served German beer that tasted nothing like the domestic brands Steve was used to. It was rich and complex, with an aftertaste that lingered on his tongue long after he swallowed. "This is good," Steve said, finishing his first bottle more quickly than he'd intended. "Strong, though." "An old family recipe," Henry replied, already opening another for him. "We Germans take our beer seriously." 2 beers in, Steve noticed the room seemed to be swaying slightly. The monsters on the screen blurred at the edges, and his reactions grew sluggish. When Henry's character saved his from a particularly vicious boss, their shoulders bumped on the couch. "Sorry," Steve mumbled, though Henry had been the one to move closer. When had that happened? The couch wasn't small, yet somehow the space between them had vanished. "Don't apologize," Henry said, his voice lower than before. "I'm enjoying this." They switched to Call of Duty, the frenetic pace of the game demanding their full attention. During an especially intense firefight, they both jerked forward, controllers gripped tight. This time, when their shoulders touched, Henry's hand came to rest on Steve's arm. "You're quite good at this," Henry whispered, his mouth suddenly very close to Steve's ear. The warmth of his breath contrasted sharply with the coolness of his touch. Steve meant to pull away, to make some joke, to create distance, but his limbs felt leaden, his thoughts muddled. The room spun lazily around him. The last thing he remembered before darkness claimed him was the pressure of Henry's hands on his shoulders and a strange sensation against his neck. Cool and wet and impossibly intimate. When consciousness returned, Steve found himself still on the couch, but Henry had moved to an armchair across the room. The gaming controllers had been neatly put away, and soft classical music now played from hidden speakers. "What happened?" Steve asked, his voice thick. His hand moved to his neck, finding it tender to the touch. "You dozed off mid-game," Henry said, watching him with an intensity that made Steve's skin prickle. "The beer, perhaps, it can be potent for those not accustomed to it." Steve checked his phone. Nearly 2 hours had passed. "I should go," he said, struggling to his feet. "I have work tomorrow." "Of course." Henry rose with fluid grace, guiding him to the door. "We should do this again. I rarely find someone who appreciates both classic strategy and modern gameplay." At the front door, Henry paused, his expression strange and searching. "Are you sure you're all right to walk home alone? You still seem affected." "I'm fine," Steve insisted, though his head pounded and his legs felt strangely weak. "It's just next door." That night, Steve's dreams were chaotic and vivid. Melissa's face morphed into Henry's and back again. In the dream, cool hands moved over his body, and a mouth pressed against his throat, painful and pleasurable, all at once. He woke repeatedly, sheets tangled around his sweat-soaked body. The dream fragments slipping away like water through cupped hands. Morning found him exhausted, as if he hadn't slept at all. In the bathroom mirror, his reflection looked pallid, with dark circles under his eyes. As he tilted his head to shave, he noticed 2 small marks on his neck, tiny puncture wounds surrounded by bruised skin. "Mosquitoes," he muttered, touching them gingerly. But it was October and mosquitoes were long gone. A spider, perhaps, or maybe he'd scratched himself in his sleep. Yet as he stared at the marks, a memory tried to surface. Of Henry leaning close, of pressure on his neck, of a whispered word he couldn't quite recall. But that made no sense. They'd been playing video games, nothing more. The days that followed settled into a strange pattern. Steve would wake exhausted, drag himself to work, and return home barely able to function. Yet as night fell, a peculiar energy would overtake him, dispelling his fatigue and filling him with restless vigor. He ran into Henry occasionally, always after sunset, always with that same magnetic pull between them. Each time, Henry would ask about his sleep, his energy levels, with a concern that seemed both genuine and somehow predatory. A week after their first gaming session, Henry invited him over again. Despite his better judgment, despite the strange dreams and inexplicable fatigue, Steve accepted. This time he promised himself he would watch his drinking. This time he would stay alert. This time he would get to the bottom of whatever was happening to him. The evening began much like the first. Video games, German beer, casual conversation that gradually grew more personal, more intimate. Henry sat closer from the start, his knee occasionally brushing Steve's, his hand sometimes lingering after passing a controller or a beer. Steve nursed his first drink slowly, determined to stay clear-headed, but halfway through, the now familiar dizziness began to creep in. The room tilted. The controller slipped from his sweaty palms. "I don't understand," he said, setting his beer down with a thud. "I've barely touched this." Henry's smile was enigmatic. "Perhaps it isn't the beer at all," he suggested, moving closer until his thigh pressed firmly against Steve's. "Perhaps it's something else entirely." "What do you mean?" Steve asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Instead of answering, Henry reached out, his cool fingers tracing the line of Steve's jaw. "You feel it too, don't you? This connection between us. It's rare to find someone so compatible." Steve wanted to pull away, to assert that he wasn't interested in men, that Henry had misunderstood. But the words wouldn't come, and worse, he wasn't entirely sure they'd be true. Because there was something here, something powerful and frightening and exhilarating all at once. He began, but Henry's fingers moved to his lips, silencing him. "Don't think," Henry whispered. "Just feel." The room spun faster. Steve felt himself falling, though whether away from Henry or toward him, he couldn't tell. As consciousness slipped away, he felt those cool lips at his neck again. No hallucination this time, but real and hungry and somehow both terrifying and thrilling. His last thought before darkness claimed him was a question that had no answer. What's happening to me? When he woke, he was alone on the couch. Henry entered from the kitchen carrying a glass of water. "You passed out again," Henry said, handing him the glass. "I'm beginning to think you can't handle your liquor, Steve." Steve took the water, his hand shaking. "This isn't normal," he said. "2 beers shouldn't do this to me." Henry sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "There are many things in this world that aren't normal," he said quietly. "Things beyond ordinary understanding." Something in his tone made Steve look up sharply. Henry was watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher. Something between hunger and affection, between predator and protector. "What are you saying?" Steve asked. Henry seemed to consider his words carefully. "I've been alone for a very long time," he finally said. "Longer than you could possibly imagine. And then you appeared, and I felt something I haven't felt in centuries." "Centuries?" Steve repeated, certain he'd misheard. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation," Henry said, ignoring the question about what's happening to you, about what I am, about what you're becoming. Before Steve could respond, a wave of dizziness washed over him again, but this time it wasn't the sluggish pull of unconsciousness. It was something else, a sharp, electric energy that crackled through his veins and set his nerves alight. He gasped as his canines suddenly throbbed with pain. His vision sharpened until he could see dust motes dancing in the dim light. And the sound, Henry's breathing, the tick of a distant clock, the scurry of a mouse behind the walls, all of it crashed over him in a deafening wave. "What's happening to me?" he demanded, panic rising in his throat. Henry's smile revealed teeth that seemed sharper than they had moments before. "You're changing," he said simply. "The process has already begun." "What process? What did you do to me?" "I gave you a gift," Henry replied, reaching out to touch the marks on Steve's neck. "My blood flows in your veins now. Just a little, but enough to start the transformation." Steve tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. The room tilted and spun, not from weakness now, but from overwhelming sensation. Colors were too bright, scents too strong, sounds too loud, and beneath it all was a new hunger, sharp and intense and terrifying. "I don't understand," he whispered, though part of him was beginning to. "Don't you?" Henry asked, his dark eyes gleaming. "Think about it, Steve. The sensitivity to sunlight, the energy at night, the hunger that food doesn't satisfy, the dreams that aren't really dreams. Steve shook his head, denying what couldn't be denied. That's not possible. Those things don't exist. And yet, Henry said, taking Steve's wrist and pressing 2 fingers against the pulse point, your heart is beating slower with each passing day. Soon it won't beat at all. The worst part wasn't Henry's words, but the fact that Steve knew they were true. He'd felt the changes in his body, dismissed the signs, rationalized the impossible. But here, now, with Henry's ancient eyes fixed on his, denial crumbled to the dust. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Henry's expression softened. "Because from the moment I saw you, I knew you were meant for this, for eternity." His fingers intertwined with Steve's. "For me." Outside, the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky. A new day approached, a day Steve suddenly dreaded with every fiber of his being. "I need to go," he said, pulling his hand from Henry's grasp. "I need to think." Henry didn't try to stop him. "The changes can't be reversed," he said as Steve stumbled toward the door. "Not now. And soon you'll need me to show you how to live with what you've become." Steve fled into the pre-dawn darkness, his mind reeling. But even as he ran, he knew Henry was right. The hunger clawing at his insides, the sensitivity to the approaching daylight, the strange new awareness of blood pulsing beneath the skin of every living thing around him. All of it confirmed what should have been impossible. He was changing, becoming something other than human, something that hungered in the darkness and fled from the light. And the most terrifying part? A small, growing part of him welcomed it. As he reached his apartment door, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. Pain seared his exposed skin like acid. He tumbled inside, slamming the door against the light, and collapsed in the darkness of his living room. Tomorrow night, he knew he would return to Henry, not because he wanted to, but because soon he would have no choice. The hunger would drive him back, the hunger and the need to understand what he was becoming. But for now, as consciousness faded once more, a single question echoed in his transforming mind. What had Henry called it? A gift or a curse? Only time would tell, and time, it seemed, was now the one thing Steve had in abundance. To be continued. This was the first part of my new vampire series. If you enjoyed it, leave a like or a comment, and if you're enjoying my content in general, I'd really appreciate you hitting the subscribe button. Either way, check out more of my work with the links on the screen, and until the next time, have a frightfully fun day.